Welcome everybody. My name is Carla Trelaw. I'm from UNSW at the Centre for Social Research in Health, and I acknowledge the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, where UNSW sits and where I'm located today. And I pay respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of all the lands you're joining from today, and extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues joining us today, especially as we are at the end of Reconciliation Week, and such an important week for us all to reflect, pause and reflect on what has happened before and the future that we might want for our country. So welcome everyone. This is a really exciting event for the Tackling Stigma in Healthcare Network, the first such event that we've run. So we have 173 people registered for the workshop today. We know that people will look at recordings later on. So hello to people who are watching later, but really pleased that you all are joining us with us today. Before I hand over to Mark Chenery to introduce himself and run the workshop for us using his expertise in communications, I just want to flag with everyone the upcoming Stigma conference happening in November. So I'm just going to put a link to in the chat to that. Abstracts close in a couple of weeks. We really would like to hear the work you've been doing, the perspectives that you want to share. So please do consider putting in an abstract. And on that webpage, you'll see how you can contact us if you want to ask any questions about that. And also there's a scholarship program for people who might need support to come along. So check that out as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark Chenery. Mark, if you could introduce yourself and then jump into the content that you're running for us today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carla. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Mark Chenery. I'm the co-founder and director at an organisation called Common Cause. We're an organisation that works exclusively with social justice, health and environmental groups to help them engage more persuasively with the Australian public. And yeah, over the last 10 years or so, we have conducted a lot of research here in Australia to understand what are the most persuasive ways to talk to the public about various different issues. And so some of those research projects have included research to explore how do you address stigma. So some recent projects around that include how do you talk to people about social security? How do we talk about homelessness? How do we talk about drugs? How do we talk about weight? How do we talk about addiction and dependence, etc.? So a lot of different projects that have at its core been about how do we well, in some cases, push for more government action and structural reform, but also at the same time, how do we reduce the stigma that is leveled at people who are experiencing perhaps harm from those systems? And what I want to do today is share with you some of the insights that we've learned from those projects, which I think are universal in terms of their applicability to stigma. I'm also going to start by kind of sharing a few of the key foundational principles upon which our approach to communications is based, so that you can understand kind of where we're coming from in terms of some of the recommendations we're making. And then what I want to spend probably about half of our time on is talking to you about myth busting and better and worse ways of doing myth busting. Because one of the things that we've seen, if we look at like what are our top tips around how to address stigma, one of them is to avoid myth busting. And because that is something that people do in ways that actually end up being myth building rather than busting. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And I want to talk to you about an approach to myth busting that is more effective and less likely to kind of do more harm. So that's what we're going to cover today. Annoyingly, because we're such a big group of people, we can't do a round of introductions, and I absolutely hate talking at people. So what I might do is just invite you to, and it might be interesting for others to see who else is in the room. So introduce yourselves in the chat. and perhaps the country that you're on, which is a reminder for me to acknowledge the country I'm on, which is different to Carla's, which is the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders here, past, present, and emerging. So if you can acknowledge the country you're on, that would be lovely in the chat. And then I've left time, or I'm leaving time for some quick sort of Q&A as we go. We're also going to do an exercise together where you'll be jumping into breakout rooms and working on something. So perhaps just if you are sort of called upon to speak, maybe just introduce yourself so we know who we're talking to. Yeah, if there's anything else that you need in terms of accessibility or usability, feel free to perhaps contact Carla in the first instance through the chat, and she'll alert me to anything I need to be doing differently. So yeah, welcome. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then we can launch into it. So yeah, like I said, so Common Cause, we do a whole bunch of different stuff. We do a lot of training, we do a lot of research, and some of the core principles or sort of some of the core elements of our approach are based on understanding human psychology and understanding what really happens to people when we are communicating with them or engaging with them. And one of the key principles is recognizing that the vast majority of human thought is subconscious. So cognitive scientists estimate at least 95% of the thinking and processing that our brains do happens below the level of conscious awareness, which means that we're not aware of it and we never have access to that subconscious processing. And in fact, most of the things that are driving our beliefs and our behaviors and our decisions in moment to moment, how we treat other people, is driven by various things, from our values to our schemas or cognitive frames, our various biases, our habits of thought, and our heuristics, so mental shortcuts that we use to sort of figure out what's right and wrong in any situation. And so when we're communicating with people, one of the things that I find is the sort of, I've got to address this misunderstanding before we can move on, is the belief that the role of good communications is to supply people with the facts they need to arrive at more logical conclusions. And given that most of our thinking is subconscious, we don't actually have access to the processes that are really leading to decisions. So it's mostly an emotional process. And as we go throughout our lives and our days, whether it's choosing what to have for breakfast or what to wear that day, or whether or not to sign up to a tackling stigma session, or who to marry, who to vote for, how to treat other people that we come across in our lives, these decisions are driven far more by how we feel at a gut level about the different options before us in that moment. And what we tend to do is we go with whatever feels most right. And then and only then, in most situations, if someone asks us, hey, Mark, why did you choose that one over that one? Or I maybe ask myself, why did I do that? That was a bit different. That's when our conscious brain kicks into gear. And it comes up with all the rational facts and figures that might post-rationalize that emotional decision. So typically the conscious brain is really only involved like the PR mechanism of the body coming up with a rationalization for our behavior. And so if we really want to understand how to influence people, we have to stop assuming that what we're doing is filling a void of facts, and instead think about what are those subconscious processes we need to tap into. Now, one of the things that influences how we feel about the different options available to us in any moment is the perspective we're taking on that issue in that moment. And so I just want to invite you in the chat to tell me what you are looking at here on this screen. What is this? Well, let's just see whether we're all in agreement. Zoe giving the game away from the very beginning. Duck, then rabbit. Duck, a rabbit albatross hybrid. Duck, bunny, rabbit, and then duck after. A bird, a duck first, then rabbit. Okay, cool. And then someone says a duck bit. I think that's a new one. I've heard them all, but maybe that's a new one. A ruck, I have heard before. Anyway, so this is a visual illusion, and it is both a duck and a rabbit, and it's neither, to be honest. And it illustrates quite an important concept in cognitive framing, which is one of the key disciplines that underpins our approach to communication, and that is of biconceptualism, the ability of the human brain to perceive the exact same thing from multiple different perspectives. And this is actually quite a revolutionary concept in communication when you truly grasp what it means, because there's a common piece of advice that communication experts give people all the time. You've probably heard it, you've maybe even said it yourself, and that is, we must meet our audience where they're at. Is that familiar advice? You've got to meet your audience where they're at. Now, that's good advice from the perspective of relating to your audience. It is really important to understand your audience. The better you understand them, the better you can relate to them. But it's hugely misleading advice if we take it to mean that there is a fixed place where our audience is at, where we must meet them. Because most people can see most issues from multiple different perspectives. So our job isn't actually to meet people where they're at. Our job is to take them to where they're capable of going and making sure that we choose a location where we're going to have the most productive conversation possible. Where at the end of the day, they're going to feel most powerfully like what we think they should do is the right thing to do, or what we want them to believe is the right thing to believe. And that's really our job, is to be strategic, know that people have sort of contradictory perspectives on issues, and figure out what is the helpful perspective on this issue and how do I engage with that, and sort of meet people there instead of into it in an unhelpful place. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an understanding of what I mean by cognitive frames. So frames are, when we talk about communication frames, we're saying, you know, hey, should we frame this issue this way or should we frame it that way? I'm sure you're all familiar with that kind of way of using the word frame. Cognitive frames is the stuff inside people's brains that means that framing can actually, changing frames actually does have an impact on people. So cognitive frames are bundles of neural networks that have wired together over time through repeated exposure to kind of similar stimuli or contexts. So for example, you have a duck frame in your brain because you have had multiple experiences of ducks or albatrosses or whatever bird you're seeing here. And as a result of that, your brain has started to make a connection. You know what? I'm constantly coming across this pattern. This is a consistent thing. I better wire this together into a network, and that will be the pattern of duck. And when when my owner comes across this, I will serve them up the perception of a duck. Now, the same is true for the rabbit. We had lots of exposure to rabbits, and over time, our brain has started to recognize a pattern and sort of hard-coded that into our neural networks. And what's interesting, though, is that if you have a look at the duck rabbit, I want you to just have a go at trying to see both, like perceive both the duck and the rabbit simultaneously. Now, you won't really be able to do it. The best you'll be able to do is to flip-flop around, or to maybe like cross your eyes and kind of see nothing at all. The reason why you can't just choose to see this new creature and like really perceive it as this thing in the way that you perceive the duck and then you perceive the rabbit is because your duck frame and your rabbit frame are kind of hardwired into your brain. You can't just choose to take a new thing and perceive it with fresh eyes. What our brain kind of forces us to do is to filter everything we're being exposed to through existing frames in our brain. So when you're communicating with someone about your issue, whatever that issue is, you are never communicating with a blank slate. Your audience, without even realizing it, is filtering what you're saying through existing frames, through existing ways, patterns, and ways of understanding the world. And that's why it's really important to be conscious about what we are activating in people's brains and what we don't want to activate in their brains. Now, one of the ways in which this biconceptual concept influences how we do our work and our research at Common Cause is we'll always split our audiences into 3 different groups, no matter what the topic is that we're working on. So I'm getting a bit of feedback, Carl. Are you able to kind of see?
Yep, got it.
People? Thanks. So 3 different groups based on their levels of biconceptualism. On the one hand, you're going to have your base. Now, these are people who are your supporters. They agree with you about the problem. They agree with you about the solution. And what makes them kind of unique in our segmentation approach is that they are not particularly biconceptual on this topic, like on your topic, which means that for analogy's sake, when you show them the duck rabbit, they only see the duck. You try as hard as you can to get them to understand there's also a rabbit there, and they're like, no, it is a duck, and there's no way that that could possibly be a rabbit. So that's our base, and that's good because it means that in theory, our opposition can't come along and convince them that they're wrong, right? So that they're with us for life, or at least for a long time. On the other hand, we've got an opposition. Now, these are people who disagree with us about the problem, and they disagree with us about the solution. And in fact, when we talk about what we think should happen, that feels at a gut level wrong to them. That automatically activates a negative emotional reaction, which is why when we're having arguments with people, they're really angry, we're really angry, and it's sort of really hard to reconcile those differences because our opposition is just as fixed in their perspective as our base, which means that you've got just as much chance of convincing your opposition that they are wrong about this as they have of convincing you that you're wrong about this. But in between, what our research has found across a whole range of social justice, health, environmental topics is that the vast majority of people are persuadable. And in terms of biconceptualism, it means that they are biconceptual. They can truly see these issues from multiple perspectives. And our job is to activate helpful perspectives in that persuadable audience to help them see the issue from that base frame of mind, but equally to avoid accidentally activating an opposition frame of mind because they are by definition capable of both. And so what that means in practice for you, just to kind of, we're not going to get into this in great detail, but it does have implications for strategy, right? It means it helps you choose who to focus on. Because I think a lot of the time in our communication, we get hyper fixated on the opposition. The opposition says something really horrible and wrong, just absolutely factually wrong. And so then we spend half a day writing an extensive piece on how they are wrong. Or sort of, if we're in a town hall meeting, say, and someone says something that's coming from that deeply wrong, unhelpful perspective, we spend all of our time kind of addressing how that is wrong. And what's happening there is we are getting caught up in their frame. We end up talking about the issue from their perspective in order to show how wrong that perspective is. But here's the thing, our brains can't think in the negative. So I'm going to tell you to do something in a moment, and I want you to genuinely try to do what I'm asking you to do. But I'm also guessing that most of you, if not all of you, will fail because your brains don't work that way. I want you to not think of something, okay? So do not think, in this moment, do not think of a cartoon elephant, like a Dumbo-style grey cartoon elephant. Don't picture its floppy ears or its trunk or whatever, right? How are you going with that? It's impossible not to do what I just asked you to do. And what happened when I said don't think of a grey cartoon elephant, you bloody thought of a grey cartoon elephant. And what happened inside your brain is your frame for cartoon elephants fired. And when neurons fire together, they wire together a little bit more, which means that your frame for grey cartoon elephants has just been minusculely strengthened. And it actually means that for the rest of today, if there is a grey cartoon elephant or something that might resemble a grey cartoon elephant somewhere in your peripheral vision, you're more likely to notice it. Now that I've just told you not to think about grey cartoon elephants. Now think about that in terms of stigma. When you tell people what not to think about other people, you are forcing them to think that thought. You're forcing them to think the things we want them to forget. Now, the other, and this is my final kind of general theory slide, is around values. So values are really, really important to how we feel. Like what feels right and what feels wrong is often guided by our values. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this value system, but I will encourage you, if you're interested, to check out the Common Cause Handbook. It's available for free on our website. So if you just Google Common Cause Handbook, you'll get it from us, or you might get it from somewhere else. Either way, the Common Cause Handbook outlines in detail this version of human values. And what we know about values is that around the world, people value all sorts of different stuff. And those values differ by culture, they differ by subculture, they differ by individuals within those cultures. But there's also similarities cross-culturally in how our value system tends to operate, the way that values tend to cluster, or the way that values tend to oppose each other, and what happens to people's attitudes and behaviors when different values are engaged in them. And the key thing to know about values is that values can be engaged. So regardless of what your audience normally values, what we call their dispositional values, it is possible to prime certain values in someone. And what we know from a whole bunch of research is that when you engage, for example, through your messaging, values around self-direction, universalism, or benevolence, it increases people's likelihood to think and act in more pro-social and pro-environmental ways. So as listed here. So people become more altruistic and cooperative, and they are more likely to support human rights, want to address poverty, want to volunteer and donate to causes they believe in. So a whole bunch of helpful attitudes and behaviors. And the values that bring that out in people is a combination of altruistic values when we're thinking about the needs and welfare of others, like benevolence values or universalism values, but also self-direction values, which is values around setting your own path in life or carving your own path in life and not necessarily following the path that others have carved for you. And we know that activating any of these different values in people increases the likelihood that they are going to think and act in more pro-social ways. On the other hand, we know that activating achievement and power values in people, which is a kind of a combination of a status, wealth-oriented, competitive, materialistic values, increases the likelihood that people will think and act in more antisocial ways and more environmentally destructive ways. And in particular, and this is super important for this topic area, we know that when people are, for example, primed to think about achievement or primed to think about success or primed to think about their image, they become more likely to discriminate against outgroups in every way you can conceive of. Nationalism, homophobia, sexism, racism, ageism, you name it. If there's an ism, it is more likely to be expressed by someone after they've had these values engaged in them. And so we definitely want to avoid activating these values in our communication. And in addition to that, there's one more values group I'll tell you about, and that's security values. When you scare people, that activates their security values. And when their security values are activated, it bleeds over into our power and achievement values and tends to activate all the same types of antisocial attitudes and behaviors associated with power and achievement, with the addition of intolerance of ambiguity, which is basically when you're fearful, you want a black and white solution to that thing that scares you. You don't want to engage in novel, creative solutions when you're feeling that fear. And so I'm just going to pause on this and just point out that that means that given that we only work with social justice, health, and environmental organizations, we're always very clear about what are helpful values to embed in your framing. And those are self-direction, universalism, and benevolence values. But equally, we want to avoid activating achievement, power, and security values in people because that has that opposite effect. Now, I'm only touching on this super, super briefly. So I do actually encourage you to check out the handbook because it will kind of tell you more information about this and some of the research it's based on. But I'm going to pause there and I'm just going to see if there's any burning questions about anything I've presented so far before we start to dive into the myth busting stuff, because I've kind of covered that all very, very quickly, I know. Is there anything in the chat, Carla, that you've noticed that I should get to?
Not yet, Mark. I think one of the really interesting things is, so how do you speak, which we're coming up to, how do you speak to self-direction, universalism, and benevolence? Like, what are those actual words, or
what does that look like? Yeah. So I will actually speak to that briefly now because I think that's useful. So what it looks like. So, and again, if you look at the detailed values map that you can download from our website, or it's in that Common Cause handbook, you'll see some of the details that give you ideas for this. But for example, within benevolence values are values that are around thinking about the needs and welfare of people beyond yourself, but limited to your in-group, the people that you have frequent contact with, your friends, your family, your neighbors, and so on. And so that includes values like honesty, helpfulness, love, friendship, responsibility. And so talking about the importance of honesty, for example, embedding that in your communications, how it's really important that we can have open and honest conversations about drugs and their impact on our lives, is one way that we found in our drug stigma research was an effective way of reducing drug stigma. So bringing in that sort of combination of actually self-direction values with open and honest in benevolence. Universalism is another one. So that is where things like social justice, broad-mindedness, a peaceful world, protecting the environment, equality, these are all universalism values. So again, anytime that we are talking about how as human beings, we all have the same inherent worth and we've got this shared humanity, that would be engaging universalism values. And then self-direction values is whenever you're talking about the importance of being true to who you are, not necessarily changing who you are to suit someone else's agenda. It is when you're talking about things like freedom and independence, choosing around goals in life, but also out of the box thinking like curiosity and creativity. That's all the sort of concepts that activate those self-direction values. But yeah, I put up this end slide for you just in case you were interested in exploring that value system, or you'll find it on the website, or feel free to get in touch with me because I know we've covered a whole bunch of topics very, very quickly. But I'll close or I'll stop and pass over to Carla.
Thanks, everyone. Just a quick thank you for being such wonderful participants in this. And of course, thanks to Mark for all the expertise. And please drop us a line if this was of interest, you want to give us some feedback, or got our other ideas that would be useful for you. So thanks, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you for all your help.
Thank you.
Thanks.